Imagine facing a moment so powerful, so deeply hurtful, that it leaves scars far beyond what the eyes can see. In this video, we uncover the painful truth behind a shocking encounter of racial abuse in broad daylight. But this isn't just about one incident. It's about the emotional toll of racism and how it shapes lives long after the words are spoken. Azura, a woman of strength and determination, fights to reclaim her dignity and confront the hate that nearly broke her. As she battles systemic discrimination and struggles to heal, we'll explore what it takes to find hope, justice, and personal resilience in a world that often turns a blind eye to racial aggression. Watch how confronting hate can lead to empowerment and healing, and why your voice matters in fighting social justice. But first, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more interesting stories. The cafe hummed with life as the city awoke to another weekday. Warm aromas of roasted coffee beans mixed with the gentle clatter of ceramic cups. Azura Vance stepped inside, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, her amber eyes scanning the bustling space for a corner seat. She carried an air of quiet confidence, her tall, slender frame moving with purpose. Her dark, wavy hair, loose and glossy, cascaded over her shoulders, framing her smooth chestnut skin. Her simple yet elegant navy blouse and tailored black slacks spoke of professionalism, but the faint smile on her lips softened the image. This cafe had become her sanctuary of sorts, a small pocket of peace before the chaos of the day. Her world as a graphic designer thrived on deadlines and revisions, but for a few moments each morning, she allowed herself the luxury of calm. Sliding into her favorite seat by the window, Azura pulled out her tablet to review a project. The city outside moved in a blur, the morning light casting long shadows of hurried pedestrians and flashing car lights on the cafe's polished floor. "Excuse me, miss," came a smooth, familiar voice. Azura looked up to see Maya, the young barista with a bright smile, standing by her table. "Your usual today?" Azura nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, please. Extra foam." As Maya turned back toward the counter, Azura caught a glimpse of herself in the reflective window pane. The image staring back at her was composed but restless, a woman who had achieved much but still wrestled with invisible weights. She brushed the thought away and focused on her tablet screen. A sudden shift in the atmosphere broke her concentration. Conversations around her dropped to murmurs. The scrape of a chair echoed louder than it should. Azura turned her head and saw him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the entitlement of someone accustomed to commanding a room. His short, graying hair was combed back sharply, his angular features set in a permanent scowl. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he looked like a man who belonged in the upper echelons of a corporate boardroom, not standing at the counter of a modest cafe. Brock Denner. The name clicked when she saw the subtle pin on his lapel, the emblem of Denner Corporation, a powerful name in real estate and finance. Though Azura had never met him personally, she'd heard his name whispered in both admiration and disdain. She returned her gaze to her tablet, determined to ignore him. But Brock's voice cut through the air, louder than the surrounding chatter. "What's taking so long?" He barked at the barista, his tone dripping with condescension. Maya fumbled with the espresso machine, her usual confidence faltering under his gaze. Azura glanced up, her brows knitting together at the scene unfolding. "Just a moment, sir," Maya stammered. "You people always have an excuse," Brock muttered, barely loud enough to hear. Azura froze. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Brock's eyes landed on her, as though sensing her reaction. He tilted his head, studying her for a moment. Azura held his gaze, her amber eyes steady, though her pulse quickened. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice as cold as a stare. She straightened in her seat. "No," she replied evenly, though her hands tightened around the tablet. Brock's smirk twisted into something cruel. "Didn't think so," he said, turning back to the counter. Azura exhaled slowly, willing herself to focus on her breathing. She wanted to brush it off, tell herself it was nothing, but the knot in her stomach tightened. Moments later, as Brock's order was called, he turned abruptly, his coffee in hand. His eyes swept the room again, landing on Azura as though daring her to speak. "People like you shouldn't be so bold," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The cafe fell silent. Azura blinked, disbelief washing over her. Her heart raced, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Around her, the patrons shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between her and Brock. "Maybe stick to where you belong," Brock added, his tone casual, almost mocking. Azura's hand trembled, her tablet slipping from her grip and thudding onto the table. A flush of heat rose to her cheeks, her emotions teetering between anger and humiliation. Maya's voice broke the tension. "Sir, that's enough," she said firmly, stepping out from behind the counter. Brock snorted, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "Relax. Just making an observation." Azura stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She grabbed her bag, her head held high, though tears stung the corners of her eyes. Without a word, she walked toward the exit, the weight of Brock's gaze burning into her back. The murmurs resumed as she stepped outside, the cool air hitting her flushed skin. Her vision blurred, but she refused to stop. She moved through the crowd, her thoughts racing. Why hadn't she said something? Why had she let him reduce her to silence? By the time she reached the corner, her tears spilled over, and she ducked into a small alley, away from the prying eyes of the city. Her breath came in sharp gasps, the earlier encounter replaying in her mind. She leaned against the cold brick wall, gripping her bag tightly. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the way everyone else in the cafe had looked away, as though his behavior was normal, acceptable. The sound of a door opening nearby pulled her back to the present. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair stepped out of a bakery. She glanced at Azura, concern flickering across her face. "Are you all right, dear?" Azura wiped her cheeks quickly, forcing a weak smile. "I'm fine. Thank you." The woman hesitated but nodded, disappearing into the crowd. Azura straightened, taking a deep breath. Fine. That was the lie she would tell herself for now. But deep down, she knew that moment in the cafe wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reminder of all the moments she'd endured before, and all the moments still to come if she stayed silent. As she walked away, the determination in her step began to return. She didn't know what her next move would be, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let this go. Not this time. Inside the cafe, Brock watched her retreating figure through the window, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. But something in her stance gave him pause, a flicker of strength that unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. Azura didn't look back. Azura closed her apartment door behind her and leaned against it, the familiar scent of eucalyptus and vanilla greeting her like an old friend. The space was hers, a reflection of her. Warm hues of mustard and cream dominated the living room, accented by eclectic pieces of art she gathered from local markets and travels. A collection of lush green plants perched on shelves and corners, thriving under her careful attention. She'd worked hard to create this sanctuary, a space where the chaos of the outside world couldn't follow her. But today, it had. She dropped her bag onto the entryway bench and slid her shoes off, her movements slow and deliberate, as though the weight of the morning clung to her like an invisible shroud. Brock Denner's words played on repeat in her mind, harsh and unforgiving, each syllable digging deeper into wounds she thought had healed long ago. "People like you shouldn't be so bold." The phrase echoed, twisting her stomach in knots. She crossed the room to her kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. The knock on her door startled her, the sound sharp and unexpected in the quiet space. Setting the glass down, she walked back to the door and opened it, revealing a familiar figure. Lavinia Hart, or Vinnie, as Azura had called her since their college days, stood in the hallway, Her platinum blonde bob framed her angular face, and her piercing blue eyes, always so quick to catch details others missed, softened as they landed on Azura. She held up a bottle of wine with a wry smile. "You look like you could use this," Vinny said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Azura sighed, shutting the door. "That obvious? Please." I could see it from the elevator. Vinny placed the wine on the kitchen counter and grabbed 2 glasses from the cabinet, like she'd done 100 times before. "Now spill." "What happened?" Azura hesitated, leaning against the counter, her arms crossed. "It's nothing." Vinny stopped mid-pour, raising a perfectly arched brow. "Try again, Zura." "You don't do nothing." Azura exhaled, the tension in her chest unraveling just enough to let the words out. "Some guy, no, not just some guy, Brock Denner. You know, the real estate tycoon? He humiliated me in a cafe this morning. Loudly, publicly." Vinny's face darkened. Humiliated how? Azura recounted the incident, each word chipping away at her composure until she was pacing the room, her hands gesturing wildly as she tried to explain the sharpness of his words, the stares of the other patrons, and the overwhelming silence that followed. When she finished, Vinny set her glass down with a firm clink. "What an arrogant, small-minded insufferable." She stopped, her jaw tightening. "I don't even have a word strong enough for him." Azura managed a weak laugh. "That makes 2 of us." "What did you do?" Vinny asked, her tone softer now. "I walked out. I couldn't. I didn't know what to say." Azura sat on the couch, her shoulders slumping. "And now I can't stop thinking about it. Why didn't anyone say anything? Why didn't I?" Vinny sat beside her, her hand resting lightly on Azura's arm. "Because you're human, Zura. You're not some unshakable superhero. You were blindsided, and that's okay. But you're not going to let this go, are you?" Azura shook her head, a spark of determination flaring in her eyes. "No, I can't. Not this time." Vinny leaned back, studying her friend. "So, what's the plan? March into his office and demand an apology?" Azura hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. All she knew was that she couldn't let Brock's words become just another incident. She filed away and tried to forget. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I need to understand why. Why he thinks it's okay to treat people like that. Why he's so full of hate." Vinny tilted her head, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You're braver than me. I'd be halfway through that wine bottle by now." Azura smirked. "That's still an option." The 2 women fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of the day slowly lifting in the presence of shared laughter and wine. But beneath the surface, Azura's mind churned with possibilities. She wasn't sure where this road would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let Brock's actions define her. Later that night, as Vinny left with a promise to check in the next day, Azura sat at her desk, the soft glow of her lamp illuminating the chaos of sketches and designs scattered across the surface. Her laptop screen reflected her face as she hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, she typed his name, Brock Denner. A flood of articles and images filled the screen, painting a picture of a man who wielded power like a weapon. She skimmed headlines about his business ventures, his connections to influential figures, and even whispers of lawsuits quietly settled behind closed doors. Her heart raced as she dug deeper, a mixture of anger and resolve propelling her forward. If Brock Denner thought he could silence her, he was wrong. The sound of the rain tapping against the window pulled her from her thoughts. She stood and walked to the window, her reflection merging with the city lights beyond. The world outside seemed endless, filled with people and stories she'd never know. But hers was just beginning. The rain blurred the glass, obscuring the view, but Azura didn't need to see the world clearly to know her place in it. She'd spent years building a life she could be proud of, carving out a space where she could thrive. Now, she was ready to protect it, The determination in her chest burned brighter than her fear, and for the first time since that morning, she felt something close to peace. The quiet hum of Azura's laptop filled the room, the only sound breaking the silence of her apartment. The light from the screen painted her face in a soft glow, illuminating the determination etched into her features. Her amber eyes were sharp and focused, scanning the information that scrolled before her. Each click of the mouse brought her deeper into Brock Denner's world, a world carefully constructed, shielded by money, power, and influence. Her research began with the basics. Brock Denner was a titan in the city's real estate industry, inheriting Denner Corporation from his father, who'd built the empire from the ground up decades ago. Publicly, Brock was a benefactor, funding city initiatives and donating to prominent charities. But beneath the polished veneer, Azura uncovered whispers of something far more sinister. There were allegations, quiet, buried stories of Brock's personal involvement in discriminatory practices. Lawsuits alleging workplace harassment had been settled out of court. Reports hinted at his aggressive role in evictions and gentrification projects that disproportionately affected marginalized communities. Each article deepened the knot in Azura's stomach. Her fingers paused on the keyboard as she came across the name Victor Hale. The connection between Brock and Victor was undeniable. Photographs of them together at galas and high-profile events confirmed it. Victor Hale, a reclusive yet immensely powerful real estate mogul, had a reputation shrouded in mystery. Rumors circulated about his covert involvement in supporting hate groups, though nothing concrete had ever surfaced. Azura leaned back in her chair, the weight of the discoveries pressing down on her. She needed help, someone with experience navigating this tangled web of power and corruption. Her mind flickered to Ronan Caldwell. She'd read his articles before, investigative pieces that dug into the city's underbelly, exposing the powerful men who tried to keep their secrets hidden. If anyone could help her make sense of this, it was him. The decision made, Azura picked up her phone. Ronan's office was a mess, the kind of chaos that hinted at a mind that never stopped working. Stacks of newspapers and open notebooks covered the desk, alongside half-empty coffee cups and a clutter of pens. The room itself was modest, with a single window that let in just enough light to see the dust motes floating in the air. Ronan Caldwell leaned against the edge of his desk, his arms crossed over his chest. He was tall, his build muscular but not overly bulky, giving him a presence that was both approachable and commanding. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd run his fingers through it too many times in frustration. His deep brown eyes studied Azura with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, his sharp jawline set in quiet contemplation. "So, let me get this straight," Ronan said, his voice low but steady. "You want to take on Brock Denner, the Brock Denner, and Victor Hale." Azura nodded, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "That's right." Ronan let out a short laugh, more disbelief than humor. "You realize these guys are untouchable, right? They've got money, lawyers, and a network of people whose job is to make sure nothing sticks to them." "I don't care," Azura said, her voice firm. "This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about all the people they've hurt, all the lives they've ruined because they think they can get away with it. Someone has to stop them." Ronan studied her for a moment, the intensity in her amber eyes catching him off guard. She wasn't just angry, she was resolute. It was a kind of determination he hadn't seen in a long time, not since he'd first started his career as a journalist, back when he still believed the truth could make a difference. "All right," he said finally, pushing off the desk and grabbing a notebook. "I'll help you, but I need to know everything you've got so far." Azura quickly outlined what she'd uncovered, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling beneath the surface. Ronan listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes or asking pointed questions. "You've done your homework," he said when she finished. "But this isn't going to be easy. These guys don't play fair, and if you're not careful, they'll bury you." Azura's jaw tightened. "Let them try." Ronan couldn't help the small smirk that tugged at the corner of his lips. She reminded him of the younger version of himself, before cynicism had settled into his bones. As the conversation continued, the tension between them shifted, replaced by a growing sense of camaraderie. Azura's fiery determination clashed with Ronan's measured approach, creating a dynamic that was both challenging and unexpectedly exhilarating. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Ronan said, leaning back in his chair. "And you're cynical," Azura shot back, her lips curving into a small smile. "Cynical keeps you alive," he quipped, though the teasing note in his voice softened the words. Azura rolled her eyes, but there was no mistaking the spark of energy between them. It wasn't romance, not yet, but there was something there, a flicker of connection that neither of them acknowledged out loud. That evening, back in her apartment, Azura sat at her desk, her thoughts tangled. Ronan had agreed to help, but his warnings lingered in her mind. This was bigger than her, bigger than Brock or Victor. It was a fight against a system designed to protect men like them. She glanced at her phone, where Ronan's number was now saved. She didn't trust him completely, not yet, but she sensed that he was the kind of person who could rise to the occasion when it mattered. Her gaze drifted to the rain-streaked window, the city lights casting faint reflections on the glass. For the first time in days, she felt something close to hope. She wasn't alone in this. And for now, that was enough. Azura stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror of her childhood bedroom. The woman staring back was composed, polished even, but her thoughts were anything but. This room, her sanctuary growing up, held memories that no amount of time could dull. The faint scent of lavender lingered from the sachets her mother, Amina, used to tuck into her drawers. The curtains, faded now but still the same soft pink, framed a window that once seemed like a portal to a better world. Her gaze drifted to the dresser, where an old picture of her mother stood, the edges of the frame worn. Azura Vance was everything Azura aspired to be, strong, selfless, and unyielding in the face of hardship. Amina's smooth mahogany skin radiated warmth, her black hair always styled in a neat bun. Her hands, calloused from years of work, had held their tiny apartment together when the world outside tried to tear it apart. Azura sat down on the bed, the mattress creaking beneath her weight. She closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her. She could almost hear her mother's voice, patient but firm, as she helped Azura with homework after a long shift cleaning offices downtown. "You're going to be somebody, Azura. Somebody they can't ignore," Amina had said. And yet, here she was, battling the same prejudice her mother had spent her life shielding her from. The sound of the doorbell pulled Azura back to the present. She stood, smoothing the front of her blouse, and headed to the door. Jared Cruz stood on the porch, his broad frame taking up the doorway. His dark eyes held the same calm assurance she remembered from years ago, though there was a softness to them now, a warmth reserved for her. Jared's short black hair was neatly combed, and he wore a tailored blazer over a crisp white shirt, the look of a man who had made something of himself. "You're not hiding in there, are you?" he teased, a small smile tugging at his lips. Azura rolled her eyes, but stepped aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you to come so soon. You called." "I came," Jared said simply, as if there had never been a time when they drifted apart. Inside, Jared took in the familiar surroundings with a nostalgic smile. "Nothing's changed," he said, running a hand along the back of the worn armchair in the corner. "Except us," Azura replied, folding her arms across her chest. Jared glanced at her, his expression softening. "You're still you, Zura. Still the girl who made the best out of what we had." Azura scoffed lightly, turning away. "The girl who ran headfirst into fights, you mean?" "And never backed down," Jared added. The two settled into the small living room, a quietness falling between them that felt both comforting and heavy. Jared leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You wouldn't have called me unless something was really bothering you," he said, his tone serious now. "What's going on?" Azura hesitated, the words catching in her throat. But Jared had always been her safe space, the one person who never judged her. Slowly, she recounted the incident at the cafe, the humiliation, and the weight it had left behind. Jared listened without interrupting, his dark eyes locked on hers. When she finished, his jaw tightened. That man, Brock Denner, he doesn't just get to walk away from this. I know, Azura said. That's why I'm doing something about it. I've already started digging into his background, his connections. But, she paused, her voice faltering. It's more than just him. It's everything. The way people looked away. The way no one said anything. It's like the whole world wants us to just accept this. Jared reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. His touch was steady, grounding. The world's been like that for too long. But you don't have to carry this alone, Zura. Azura's gaze dropped to their hands, her chest tightening. I'm not good at letting people help, she admitted. I know, Jared said, his voice gentle. But I'm not people. I'm me. The honesty in his words broke something inside her, a crack in the armor she'd built around herself. She pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. I don't need saving, Jared, she said, her tone sharper than she intended. Jared stood as well, his calm demeanor unshaken. I'm not here to save you, Zura. I'm here to remind you that you're not alone. There's a difference. Azura turned toward the window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. I can't go back to who I was before all this, she said softly. No one's asking you to, Jared replied. But you can't let him or anyone else. Take away the person you've worked so hard to become. Azura glanced over her shoulder, meeting his gaze. For a moment, the unspoken tension between them hung in the air. Their history, their closeness, it was all there, just beneath the surface. You've always had a way with words, Azura said, her lips curving into a faint smile. Jared grinned. Part of the job. The sound of her mother's old clock chiming broke the moment. Azura sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't know where this is going, Jared, but I need to see it through. Then I'll be here, he said, his voice steady. Whatever you need. Azura nodded, the weight on her chest feeling just a little lighter. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but knowing Jared was by her side gave her the strength to keep moving forward. As Jared left, Azura stood on the porch, watching his car disappear down the street. The memories of their childhood together, of the fights they'd faced and the victories they'd claimed, played in her mind like a reel of old film. Inside, the house was quiet again, but the silence didn't feel as heavy. Azura glanced at the picture of her mother on the dresser, the memory of her words ringing in her ears. You're going to be somebody, Azura. Somebody they can't ignore. She turned back to the window, her reflection merging with the fading light outside. She was far from finished, but she wasn't alone. And for now, that was enough. The air in Ronan's office felt heavier than usual, a charged undercurrent threading through the small, cluttered space. Azura paced the room, her sharp amber eyes darting toward the wall of news clippings and hastily scribbled notes Ronan had pinned up like pieces of a puzzle. Each connection, each lead they'd uncovered, pointed toward one name, Victor Hale. This isn't just about Brock anymore, Azura said, her voice firm but tinged with frustration. Hale's the real power here. If we don't understand his role, we'll always be playing catch-up. Ronan leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest. His dark brown eyes, usually skeptical and guarded, softened slightly as they tracked her movements. He admired her intensity, though he'd never say it outright. You don't just approach someone like Victor Hale, Ronan said. The man's untouchable. He's got half the city in his pocket. Then we need someone who knows him, Azura countered, stopping mid-step to face him. Ronan's lips twitched into a faint smirk. Funny you should say that. I might know someone. Azura raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. Who? They met Sage Winters in the back of a dimly lit bar, the kind of place where people went to forget their troubles or to plot their next move. The faint scent of whiskey and cigar smoke clung to the air, and the muted hum of conversations filled the room. Sage was already seated at a booth in the corner, her posture relaxed, but her sharp eyes scanning every face that entered. She was in her mid-30s with short, jet-black hair cut into a precise pixie style that framed her angular features. Her piercing gray eyes gave nothing away, but there was an unmistakable weight in her gaze, the kind that came from knowing too much about the wrong kind of people. "Sage," Ronan greeted, sliding into the booth across from her. Azura followed, sitting beside him. Sage's eyes flicked to Azura, sizing her up in a single glance. "This is her." "Huh?" "The woman taking on Brock Denner." Azura met her gaze evenly. "And you're the one who used to work for Hale?" Sage's lips quirked into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Not anymore. Let's just say I found out too much for his liking." Azura leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent. "We need your help. Hale's connection to Brock is bigger than we realized. If we're going to stop this, we need to know how deep it goes." Sage tilted her head, studying Azura as though weighing her sincerity. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But brave doesn't mean ready. Hale's not just a man, he's an institution. He's been playing this game longer than you've been alive." "Then tell us how to play it," Azura said firmly. Sage leaned back, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "Hale doesn't get his hands dirty. That's what Brock is for. The Denner family has been his enforcers for decades, keeping certain neighborhoods clean and ensuring the right people stay in power. If you're going after Hale, you're going to need more than righteous anger." Ronan's voice broke the tension. "That's where you come in. You know his network better than anyone." Sage glanced at him, her expression softening just enough to show a hint of trust. "I'll help you, but on one condition. If we do this, we do it smart. No heroics, no rushing in blind." Azura nodded. "Agreed." The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning and late-night strategy sessions. Sage proved to be an invaluable asset, her knowledge of Hale's inner circle painting a picture of a man who operated with ruthless precision. In between research and coordination, Azura and Ronan found themselves growing closer. Their conversations shifted from strategy to moments of shared vulnerability, Azura opening up about her mother's sacrifices, and Ronan revealing the disillusionment that had crept into his work as a journalist. One evening, as they sat in Ronan's office, surrounded by stacks of papers and empty coffee cups, the tension between them reached a breaking point. "You know," Ronan began, his voice quieter than usual, "you're not what I expected." Azura glanced at him, her amber eyes questioning. "What did you expect?" Ronan shrugged, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Someone who'd give up when things got tough. But you're relentless." Azura's lips curved into a small smile. "That's because I don't have a choice. If I don't fight, who will?" For a moment, their gazes locked, the unspoken connection between them simmering just beneath the surface. But before either of them could say more, the sound of Sage's voice broke the moment. "Hey, lovebirds," she called from the doorway, her tone dry. "We've got a problem." Azura and Ronan both turned, the weight of her words snapping them back to reality. "What kind of problem?" Ronan asked, standing. Sage's expression was grim. "Hale's men. They know you're digging, and they're coming." The three of them moved quickly, gathering what they could before leaving the office. Sage led them to a safe house she'd secured years ago, a nondescript apartment in an unremarkable part of the city. As they entered, Azura's heart raced, the adrenaline of the situation sharpening her senses. The apartment was sparse but functional, with a couch, a table, and a few chairs. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Sage locked the door behind them, her movements precise and practiced. "We'll be fine here for now," she said. Azura nodded, though her mind raced with questions. How had Hale's men found them so quickly? And what would they do next? Ronan stepped closer, his presence steadying. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice calm. Azura met his gaze, the weight of the moment settling between them. I hope you're right, she said quietly. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual chaos, oblivious to the storm brewing in the shadows. Inside the apartment, Azura, Ronan, and Sage prepared for whatever came next, their fragile alliance the only thing standing between them, and the forces determined to silence them. The warehouse stood at the edge of the city, its weathered exterior blending into the industrial landscape. Azura shivered as they approached, the cool night air biting against her skin. She pulled her coat tighter around her chest, her amber eyes darting to Ronan and Sage. "This is the place?" she asked, her voice low. Ronan nodded, his tousled dark brown hair catching the faint glow of the streetlights. "Landon doesn't open his doors to just anyone. We're lucky he owes me." Sage raised an eyebrow, her sharp gray eyes skeptical. "Define lucky." Before Ronan could answer, the heavy metal door creaked open. A man stepped into the light spilling from the warehouse's interior, his tall, broad frame casting a long shadow. Landon Black was striking in a way that made people stop and reconsider their approach. His perfectly groomed black hair and cold gray eyes gave him an air of precision, of control. His tailored black shirt and dark jeans hinted at someone who preferred practicality over flash, but the meticulous fit suggested wealth or, at the very least, careful planning. "You're late," Landon said, his deep voice even, yet tinged with irritation. He gestured for them to enter, stepping aside to let them pass. Azura hesitated for a moment, her instincts on high alert. There was something about Landon that unsettled her, not fear exactly, but a feeling that he saw too much, that he understood more than he let on. Inside, the warehouse was a curious mix of functionality and comfort. The main space was dominated by shelves stacked with files, tools, and nondescript boxes. A section in the corner, however, had been converted into a living area, complete with a leather couch, a small kitchen, and a worn wooden table. It was minimalistic but not cold, the kind of place someone used more for necessity than leisure. Landon closed the door behind them, the heavy click of the lock echoing in the silence. "You didn't tell me you were bringing extras," he said, his gaze flicking to Azura and Sage. "Consider them part of the package," Ronan said, leaning casually against a nearby shelf. Landon's eyes lingered on Azura for a beat too long, his expression unreadable. "I don't do charity," he said. "And I don't waste time," Azura shot back, her voice steady. A ghost of a smirk touched Landon's lips. "Fair enough." He gestured toward the table. "Let's talk." Seated around the table, the four of them began to piece together the puzzle of Victor Hale's network. Sage laid out the details she knew: the shell companies, the hidden accounts, the names of enforcers who operated under the radar. "Hale's smart," Sage said, her tone measured. "He keeps his distance from the dirty work. That's what men like Brock Denner are for. And you think we can take him down with this?" Azura asked, gesturing to the scattered papers. Landon leaned back in his chair, his expression impassive. "This isn't about taking Hale down. It's about surviving long enough to do it." Azura met his gaze, her frustration simmering. "Surviving isn't enough. Not for me." Landon studied her for a moment, something flickering in his gray eyes. "Then you'd better be prepared to lose everything," he said quietly. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room fell silent. Later that evening, Azura found herself standing by one of the large warehouse windows, the faint hum of the city beyond a distant reminder of the world they were fighting for. "You look like you've got questions," Landon's voice came from behind her. Azura turned to see him leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his broad chest. His presence was imposing, but there was a quietness about him that softened the edges. "More than I can count," she admitted. Landon tilted his head, his gaze steady. "Ask one." Azura hesitated, then took a step closer. "Why are you helping us? What's in it for you?" For the first time, something in Landon's expression shifted, a crack in the stoic mask. "Maybe I'm just trying to balance the scales," he said, his voice low. Azura frowned. "What does that mean?" Landon exhaled, his gaze drifting to the window. I've done things I'm not proud of, things I can't undo. Helping you might not fix any of it, but it's a start. Azura studied him, her frustration giving way to curiosity. You talk like someone who's given up. Landon's lips twitched into a faint smile. And you talk like someone who hasn't been broken yet. The words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Meanwhile, Ronan paced the warehouse, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore the tension building between Azura and Landon, though he wasn't sure if it was trust or something deeper. It gnawed at him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Sage watched him from her seat, her gray eyes sharp. "You're jealous," she said bluntly. Ronan stopped, narrowing his eyes at her. "I'm concerned." Sage smirked, leaning back. "Whatever you need to tell yourself." Ronan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "This isn't the time for distractions." Sage raised an eyebrow. "You mean her?" Ronan didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. As the night wore on, the group reconvened, their determination renewed. Landon spread a map across the table, marking locations connected to Hale's operations. "This is where we start," he said, his voice firm. "But we'll need more than this if we're going to make a dent." Azura leaned over the map, her amber eyes blazing with resolve. "Then we keep digging, no matter what it takes." Ronan watched her, a mix of admiration and worry swirling within him. She was relentless, and while he admired her strength, he couldn't shake the fear of what it might cost her or them. Across the table, Landon's gaze lingered on Azura as well, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd buried long ago: hope. The storm brewing within their small group was nothing compared to the one waiting outside the warehouse walls. And though none of them said it out loud, they all knew that their fight was only just beginning. The knock at the warehouse door came late into the night, sharp and insistent. Azura froze, the weight of the map she'd been studying suddenly insignificant. She exchanged a glance with Ronan, whose hand instinctively went to his side, brushing against the concealed weapon he carried. "Were you expecting someone?" Landon asked from his spot by the window, his voice low but edged with suspicion. "No," Azura replied, her tone clipped. Sage approached the door cautiously, her sharp gray eyes narrowing. "Stay back," she ordered, glancing over her shoulder. With calculated precision, she cracked the door open, only to relax slightly when she saw who was standing there. "It's for you," Sage said, stepping aside. Azura stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Lavinia Vinny, Hart standing in the dim light. Vinny's platinum blonde bob framed her sharp features, her radiant blue eyes shadowed with something unreadable. "Vinny?" Azura's voice was a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Can we talk?" Vinny asked, her voice quieter than usual. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. The tension in the room was palpable. Ronan remained where he was, his dark brown eyes flicking between Azura and Vinny, while Landon stayed in the background, watching silently. "What are you doing here?" Azura asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Vinny hesitated, glancing around the room before her gaze landed back on Azura. "I had to see you. There's something you need to know." They moved to a quieter corner of the warehouse, though the weight of the other's eyes followed them. Vinny stood with her arms crossed, her usually confident demeanor faltering. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," Vinny began, her voice trembling slightly. "Find out what?" Azura demanded. Vinny sighed, running a hand through her sleek bob. "I've been working with Hale." The words hit Azura like a blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She stared at Vinny, her mind scrambling to process what she'd just heard. "You what?" Azura's voice cracked, disbelief etched into every syllable. "It's not what you think," Vinny said quickly, her blue eyes pleading. "I didn't have a choice, Zura." "There's always a choice," Azura shot back, her voice rising. "You don't understand," Vinny snapped, her composure cracking. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. You think it's easy for someone like me? Trying to hold on to what little I have in a city run by men like Hale? He owns everything Azura. If I didn't work for him, I'd lose everything. Azura shook her head, anger and betrayal warring within her. So you sold me out? You sold us out. I didn't sell anyone out. Vinny insisted. I tried to protect you. But Hale's people know about what you're doing. They're coming for you, Zura. If you don't stop. What? Azura interrupted. If I don't stop, what? I lose everything? Guess what, Vinny? I've already lost more than you could imagine. The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with unspoken words. Across the room, Ronan watched the confrontation with barely concealed frustration. This is exactly why we shouldn't trust anyone outside of this group, he muttered. You think, Sage replied dryly, her gray eyes never leaving Vinny. Landon, however, stepped forward, his expression calm but his presence commanding. This isn't helping. Ronan turned to him, his dark eyes flashing. And you think letting her stay is... Enough! Azura's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She turned back to Vinny, her amber eyes blazing. Why are you really here? Vinny hesitated, her polished exterior cracking further. Because I couldn't let this happen to you. You don't know what Hale is capable of. He's not just going to threaten you. He's going to destroy you. And you thought what? Azura asked, her voice cold. That you'd swoop in and save me? No, Vinny admitted, her voice breaking. I wanted to warn you. I don't want to see you get hurt. Azura stared at her, the weight of their years of friendship pressing down on her like an anchor. She wanted to believe Vinny, but the betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow. You need to leave, Azura said finally, her voice steady but hollow. Zura, leave, Azura repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Vinny's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she nodded, turning and walking out of the warehouse without another word. The silence that followed was suffocating. Azura leaned against the table, her hands gripping the edge as she tried to steady herself. You okay? Ronan's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Azura didn't look at him. She was my best friend, and now she's working for the enemy, Ronan said bluntly, his frustration bubbling over. You can't trust her. Do you think I don't know that? Azura snapped, her amber eyes flashing as she turned to face him. Ronan took a step back, his jaw tightening. This is why we need to focus. No more distractions, no more. You think this is a distraction? Azura interrupted, her voice rising. This is my life, Ronan. My fight. And what about us? Ronan shot back before he could stop himself. The question hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Azura's breath caught, her anger giving way to something more vulnerable. There is no us, she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. Ronan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Landon stepped between them, his cold gray eyes cutting through the tension. Enough, Landon said firmly. This isn't the time. Azura turned away, her heart pounding. She felt torn, pulled in too many directions, her emotions fraying at the edges. As the night wore on, the group fell into a tense silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Azura stood by the window, staring out at the city beyond the warehouse walls. She didn't know who to trust anymore, not Vinny, not even herself. But one thing was certain, she couldn't afford to let her guard down again. The night was thick with tension as the car rolled to a stop just outside the sprawling iron gates of Victor Hale's estate. From the passenger seat, Azura gazed at the vast mansion in the distance. The building loomed against the dark sky, illuminated by soft floodlights that accentuated its grandeur. The estate was an empire unto itself, opulent, cold, and impenetrable. Azura's grip tightened on the stack of documents in her lap. These weren't just papers. They were the culmination of weeks of digging, countless nights spent connecting dots and putting herself in danger for a single purpose, to bring Hale down. You're sure about this? Ronan asked, his voice low as he turned toward her. His dark brown eyes searched hers for hesitation. She nodded, her amber eyes blazing with determination. This is the only way. We have to get inside. We have to show him we're not afraid. From the back seat, Sage adjusted her black jacket, her gray eyes scanning the security cameras mounted along the fence. Hale doesn't like surprises. If we're going to pull this off, we have to be quick. In and out. Landon? Azura asked, glancing over her shoulder. Leaning against the car, Landon Black adjusted the cuffs of his tailored black shirt. His tall, broad-shouldered frame seemed at ease, but his sharp gray eyes missed nothing. Security's tight but not flawless, he said. There's a service entrance around the back. I can get us in, but after that, it's on you. Azura nodded, her stomach twisting into knots. The weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders. But this was her fight. She had started it, and she would finish it. Inside the estate, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive leather and polished wood. The grand hallway was lined with priceless art, chandeliers glittering above like constellations. But there was no time to admire the luxury. Azura moved quickly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet as she followed Landon through the labyrinth of rooms. "Where's Hale?" Ronan asked in a hushed voice, glancing over his shoulder. "Upstairs," Sage replied. "His office is at the end of the west wing. That's where we'll find him." As they ascended the winding staircase, Azura's heart pounded. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every distant murmur of voices felt amplified, like the house itself was alive, watching their every move. Finally, they reached Hale's office. The door was a heavy oak monstrosity, as imposing as the man who owned it. "This is it," Landon said, his voice low. Azura stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. But before she could turn it, the door swung open. Victor Hale stood on the other side, his cold blue eyes locking onto hers. "Miss Vance," he said smoothly, his voice like ice. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Victor Hale was every bit as intimidating as Azura had imagined. Tall and broad, with silver hair slicked back and a perfectly tailored suit that exuded power. He radiated the kind of authority that came from decades of control. His expression was unreadable, his lips curling into a faint, condescending smile. Azura squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze with unflinching resolve. "You know why I'm here." Hale's smile widened slightly. "I do. And yet, I can't imagine what you think you'll accomplish." "We have proof," Ronan said, stepping forward. "Evidence of your illegal dealings, your shell companies, your ties to hate groups, everything." Hale's gaze shifted to Ronan, then to the others. "Evidence," he said, almost amused. "And what do you plan to do with it? Take it to the authorities?" "The same authorities I've been funding for years." Azura's jaw tightened. "We're not here to debate. This ends tonight." For the first time, Hale's smile faded, replaced by something colder. "You've made a grave mistake coming here." The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, and Azura turned to see Brock Denner stepping into the room. "You!" Azura breathed, her hands curling into fists. Brock smirked, his graying hair and sharp features giving him a wolfish appearance. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" The confrontation quickly escalated. Brock lunged toward Azura, his voice rising in anger, but Ronan stepped between them, shoving Brock back. "Touch her, and I swear," Ronan growled, his tone deadly. Brock sneered. "What are you going to do? Write another article?" "Enough," Hale barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He turned to Azura, his expression unreadable. "I'll give you one chance to leave. Walk away now, and I might forget this ever happened." Azura shook her head. "I'm not walking away. Not this time." Hale's eyes narrowed. "Then you leave me no choice." With a snap of his fingers, the door burst open and armed guards flooded the room. Chaos erupted. Ronan and Landon moved quickly, disarming one of the guards and using his weapon to hold the others at bay. Sage ducked behind the desk, pulling Azura down with her as bullets ricocheted off the walls. "You okay?" Sage asked, her gray eyes sharp with concern. "I'm fine," Azura said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Amid the chaos, Hale and Brock slipped out of the room, disappearing down a hidden passage. "They're getting away!" Azura shouted, pushing to her feet. "Go!" Landon called, holding off the remaining guards. Ronan grabbed Azura's arm, pulling her toward the passage. "Come on!" They raced down the narrow hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing around them. The passage led to a private courtyard, where Hale and Brock were already climbing into a waiting car. Azura sprinted forward, her heart pounding. "Hale!" she shouted. Hale turned, his expression calm and cold as the car door closed behind him. "You've made a mistake, Miss Vance," he said through the open window. "A mistake you'll regret." The car sped away, leaving Azura standing in the courtyard, her chest heaving with frustration. Back inside the mansion, the group regrouped. The guards had been subdued, but the fight wasn't over. "They're running scared," Ronan said, his voice laced with determination. "We hit a nerve, but they're not done," Azura said, her amber eyes blazing. "And neither are we." The city seemed quieter in the early morning light, as though it, too, were holding its breath after the storm. Azura stood at the edge of the pier, the soft wind tugging at her dark, wavy hair. The water stretched out before her, calm and unbroken, a stark contrast to the chaos that had dominated her life for weeks. The evidence they had uncovered was everywhere now, on the news, on social media, in whispered conversations on the streets. Victor Hale's empire was crumbling, piece by carefully constructed piece. But the fallout wasn't clean. It never was. Azura tightened her coat around her chest, her amber eyes fixed on the horizon. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Hale might have fled, but his influence lingered in the system he had spent decades corrupting. "I figured I'd find you here." Ronan's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see him walking toward her, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his leather jacket. His dark brown hair was tousled, as though he hadn't slept, and his expression carried the weariness of someone who had been fighting for far too long. "Couldn't sleep?" Azura asked, her voice soft. He shrugged, stopping a few feet away. "Sleep feels like a luxury these days." Azura smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's not over, is it?" "No," Ronan said, his tone heavy with truth. "But we've done something, Zura. People are listening. They're paying attention now." Azura turned back to the water, her shoulders tense. "Sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, it's never enough." Ronan stepped closer, his presence steadying. "It's not about fixing everything at once. It's about taking the first step. And you've done that." Back at the warehouse, the aftermath of their actions hung over the group like a storm cloud. Landon stood by the window, his gray eyes scanning the street below for any sign of trouble. He had been quieter than usual since the raid on Hale's estate, his stoic demeanor masking whatever emotions churned beneath the surface. Sage sat at the table, her sharp features illuminated by the glow of her laptop. She was sifting through the flood of tips and messages they had received after releasing the evidence. "This is just the beginning," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Hale's network is unraveling, but it's going to take years to dismantle it completely." "We don't have years," Azura said as she entered the room, Ronan trailing behind her. "We have to keep the momentum going." Landon turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You've already done more than most people would even dream of. Don't forget that." Azura met his gaze, her amber eyes steady. "I didn't do this for recognition, Landon. I did it because it needed to be done." Landon nodded, but something in his expression softened, as though he saw in her a reflection of his own past struggles. Later that night, as the others drifted into restless sleep, Azura found herself alone with Ronan in the quiet of the warehouse. The tension that had been building between them for weeks was impossible to ignore now, the air thick with unspoken words. "You're not done, are you?" Ronan asked, his voice low. Azura glanced at him, her heart tightening. "How can I be? There's still so much left to do." Ronan stepped closer, his dark eyes searching hers. "You don't have to do it alone, Zura. You know that, right?" Her breath hitched, the vulnerability in his words cutting through her defenses. "Ronan, He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but grounding. "You're the bravest person I've ever met. But even you need someone to lean on." For a moment, Azura allowed herself to feel the weight of his words, the truth in them. She wanted to lean on him, to let herself be held, but a part of her still hesitated. "What happens when this is all over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ronan's gaze didn't waver. "We figure it out. Together." The simplicity of his answer broke something inside her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. As dawn broke, the warehouse came alive with the sound of movement. Sage was already back at her laptop, her gray eyes scanning new intel, while Landon prepared for the next step in their mission. Azura stood by the window, watching as the city began to stir. Ronan joined her, his presence warm and steady. "Ready?" he asked. Azura turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Always." The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Azura felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of it alone. Together, they would face whatever came next. The air in the city felt different that morning, crisp and alive with the promise of change. For the first time in what felt like forever, Azura walked with her shoulders relaxed, her stride purposeful but light. She didn't glance over her shoulder or scan the street for shadows. This fight was over, and though new ones might come, she knew she could face them. The small cafe she had frequented for years sat on the corner, its brick exterior weathered but welcoming. She hesitated before stepping inside, the memory of her first confrontation with Brock lingering in the back of her mind. But the fear that had gripped her then was gone. Now, she felt only a calm certainty that she belonged wherever she chose to be. The barista, a young man with sandy hair, smiled warmly as she approached the counter. "The usual?" Azura smiled back, her amber eyes bright. "Yes, please." She found a table by the window, the morning sun streaming through the glass. The city outside buzzed with life, the sounds of passing cars and distant chatter weaving together into a comforting symphony. For the first time, she let herself simply exist in the moment. Later that afternoon, Azura returned to her apartment, the familiar warmth of her space wrapping around her like a favorite coat. The plants she had so lovingly cared for were thriving, their vibrant green leaves catching the soft light from the window. Her sketches and designs were spread across her desk, reminders of the life she had built for herself. She glanced at her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a number she had memorized long ago. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Azura?" "Hey, Mom," Azura said, her voice soft but steady. Amina's voice was warm, laced with pride. "You sound different. Lighter." Azura smiled, her chest tightening at the sound of her mother's voice. "It's been a long road, but I think I'm finally where I need to be." "I knew you would be," Amina said. "You've always been stronger than you realize." Azura closed her eyes, letting her mother's words sink in. They spoke for a while longer, catching up on the little things they hadn't had time to talk about during the chaos of the last few months. When Azura hung up, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't realized she was missing. That evening, Ronan showed up unannounced, his familiar leather jacket slung over his shoulder. He had a knack for showing up when she needed him most, though she'd never admit it. "You didn't call," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Azura raised an eyebrow. "And yet, here you are." He smirked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I thought I'd check in, make sure you weren't planning your next crusade without me." Azura rolled her eyes, but couldn't help the smile tugging at her lips. I think I've earned a break. Ronan dropped onto her couch, stretching out as though he belonged there. So what now? Azura hesitated, glancing toward her desk where her unfinished design sat waiting. I don't know, she admitted. For the first time, I don't have a plan. That's okay, Ronan said, his voice softer now. Sometimes it's enough to just be. Azura sat beside him, the quiet between them settling like a comforting blanket. She leaned back, letting herself relax fully for the first time in weeks. The next morning, Azura found herself standing in front of the community center, where she had once taken art classes as a child. The building was small and unassuming, its brick exterior painted with a colorful mural that depicted scenes of the neighborhood. She stepped inside, the smell of paint and wood varnish hitting her immediately. The director, an older woman with kind eyes and a wide smile, greeted her warmly. Azura Vance, the woman said, her voice filled with recognition. I heard about what you've been doing. You've made us all proud. Azura felt her cheeks flush. Thank you. I actually wanted to ask if you needed volunteers. The woman's face lit up. We could always use more hands. The kids would love someone like you. Azura spent the day helping children with their art projects, guiding their small hands as they painted and sketched. Their laughter filled the room, and for the first time, Azura felt the weight of her past lift completely. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Azura found herself back at the pier. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the warm hues of the sunset. She stood there for a long time, letting the cool breeze brush against her skin. Ronan joined her, his footsteps soft against the wooden planks. He didn't say anything at first, simply standing beside her as they watched the water together. It's beautiful, Azura said, her voice barely above a whisper. It is, Ronan agreed, though his eyes were on her, not the view. She turned to him, her amber eyes meeting his. For a moment, the world seemed to still, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the pier. Thank you, she said, her voice steady. Ronan frowned slightly. For what? For being here, Azura said. For not letting me give up. He smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile that softened the sharp edges of his face. You didn't need me for that. You were always going to fight. It's who you are. Azura took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. I don't know what's next, she admitted. Ronan squeezed her hand gently. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Together. As the last light of the day faded, Azura stood there, her heart full for the first time in what felt like forever. The future was uncertain, but she was ready to face it because this time, she knew she wouldn't be facing it alone. Thanks for watching. What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more interesting stories.